Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to this session of Rise Up for Justice, Black Lives in Our Collective Future. This is the sixth in a series of live stream events that recognize the pivotal role that the Black Lives Matter uprising is having on reshaping our relationship with Black lives and its profound implications for our collective future. My name is Phi Nguyen, and I'm a civil rights attorney and the litigation director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. Advancing Justice Atlanta's mission is to protect the civil rights of AAPI communities in Georgia. At Advancing Justice Atlanta, I work broadly in the areas of voting rights and immigrant justice. Today's program is called White Supremacy, Infecting the COVID-19 Response and Corrupting Democracy. Today, we will bring together academic and activist analysis on how the far right is using the COVID-19 pandemic to further the white supremacist movement and to undermine democratic institutions. Today's program is sponsored by the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley in collaboration with Inland Empowerment, We the People Michigan, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Atlanta. We are so excited that you're able to join us today, and we invite you to send us questions through the live chat throughout our conversation. But before I introduce our panelists for today, I'd like to share with you a short video called A Grief Letter to COVID. It's a poem written by Leo Carmago and produced by the Center for Cultural Power.
COVID,
you ravaging monster.
If you could,
please listen.
I don't know why the universe brought you to us.
Somehow,
in a sick way.
I feel like maybe we needed you.
Do I need to thank you?
Do I need to thank you?
Do I need to thank you?
I mean, you've been taking on a bigger beast.
You keep showing us who's really to blame.
That even in a crisis, we are the last to be protected.
Last to be seen.
Last to be vaccinated.
Hit first.
Hit hard. We are hit.
And hit. COVID, you are our wake-up call.
You are reminding us that no matter what,
we need to save us.
Care for us.
We've got us.
COVID, you literal virus.
You spread and no sea, land, or distance is a barrier for you.
Stop taking our families.
Stop taking our loved ones.
Deja a mi familia en paz.
Deja a mi familia en paz.
Deja a mi familia en paz.
COVID, we're done.
We're done.
We're breaking up with you.
We're breaking up with the systems
keeping us down.
This abusive relationship
needs to stop.
We will draw tarot cards,
cast protection spells,
and pray.
Oh God, how we have prayed.
But we're done.
Take this as a warning.
A warning to the greedy.
A warning to the supremacists.
A warning to the systems that be.
We are done being seen last.
We are done being ignored.
We are done being ignored.
We demand vaccinations now.
We demand healthcare now.
We demand pay to stay home.
COVID,
slow us all down.
So that our loved ones can recover.
So that we can curb the spread.
So that we can fight for more vaccines.
This is our last call.
So COVID, go away to where you came from.
And while you're at it, take the greed, take the racism, take the injustice to us, our kinship, and our planet.
Take everything that isn't working with you.
And go away.
Sincerely,
the people who are sick of this shit.
The people who are sick of this shit.
The people who are sick of this shit.
I think that really helps to set the tone for our conversation today. But again, that's the poem is written by Leo Camargo. It's called A Grief Letter to COVID, and it was produced by the Center for Cultural Power. You can follow them as @CultureStrike on Instagram, and they work to ignite change at the intersection of art, culture, and social justice, and growing a movement where artists are at the heart of social change. I think I'm just as excited as you all are to hear from our panelists. But before I turn the floor over to them, I do think it's important for you to understand my connection to the conversation that we're having today. As an Asian American, I do want to explicitly call out how Trump's references to COVID-19 as a China virus and the Kung flu have had devastating consequences on AAPI communities across the country. Our businesses are down, anti-Asian violence is on the rise, and our communities are frankly hurting. But as a voting rights attorney in Georgia, I do feel compelled to use this time to share with you a different aspect of my work and of my lived experiences that I think is particularly salient to our conversation that we're having today, and that has a broader impact on all communities of color. And what that is that I want to share with you how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the history of voter suppression in the state of Georgia. In Georgia, our elected leaders have played up the lie of voter fraud while downplaying the truth of the COVID-19 pandemic. We had record voter turnout in the 2020 presidential election and in the subsequent Senate runoffs in January, notwithstanding the pandemic. This was, of course, thanks first and foremost to the massive multi-ethnic, multiracial years of community organizing efforts in Georgia. But the other thing that allowed our voter turnout to be as vast as it was the option for voters to vote safely and securely by mail. In the November 2020 election, over 1.3 million Georgians, which was roughly a third of everybody who voted by mail. And just to give you context, that's more than 30 times the number of people who voted by mail in the 2016 election. And the thing is, the majority of voters who elected to vote by mail in 2020 were voters of color. And they were voters of color who helped deliver a victory to Joe Biden. And as a direct result of that, what we're now seeing play out right now in the Georgia legislature, which is now in session and has been in session since January, is an all-out attack on voting. Since the legislative session started in January, there have been more than 70 voter suppression bills introduced. And the most egregious of those bills are ones that propose to gut voting by mail, even while we are in the middle of a pandemic still. And in Georgia, we are no strangers to anti-voting laws. We fight them at our state capitol every year. But what does feel different about this year, and what is more remarkable about this session, is the way in which the pandemic has enabled our lawmakers to make cuts to our voting rights with far less transparency and far less public input. And that's because people have to decide right now what's more important. Is it more important for people to march down to our state capitol to speak out against the threat of white supremacy, or is it more important for them to shelter in their house to protect themselves and their families and loved ones and our society at large against the threat of COVID-19? And here's the other thing. The lawmakers who are pushing for these restrictions to voting are all doing this in the name of election integrity, even though there was absolutely no evidence of any widespread voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election. And you know that that was widely investigated in Georgia, and we had 2 different recounts. On the other hand, what we have seen is, and what we do know, and what the evidence bears out, is that over 500,000 Americans and nearly 17,000 Georgians have died from COVID-19. And yet, in our state, our bars and our gyms are open. Our governor has refused throughout the pandemic to implement a mask mandate. And famously, there's a congresswoman from our state who refused to put on a mask that was offered to her by a colleague when she was locked down during the January 6th insurrection at the federal Capitol. And so I think all of that is important to bear in mind as we turn to this conversation with our panelists. And the first person that I actually want to introduce to sort of set the context and give an overview of what we're talking about today is Denise Hurd. Denise Hurd is the OBI's Associate Director and a professor of public health at UC Berkeley. Her scholarship centers on racialized disparities in health outcomes, spanning topics as varied as images of drugs and violence in rap music, drinking and drug use patterns, social movements, and the impact of corporate targeting and marketing on popular culture among African American youth. And in honor of Women's History Month, I actually asked each of the panelists to name a woman that they would like to thank or that they admire. And Denise would like to thank her mother, and she admires in her mother her spirit of perseverance and optimism despite challenges. So welcome, Denise. So excited to have you here and to be in conversation with you. My first question for you is Donald Trump, and as well as the far-right pundits and political actors, not only fomented insurrection January 6th, they've also been science deniers, have promoted racist conspiracy theories about COVID-19, fomented violence against Asian people, defied masking mandates, and have suggested that the pandemic is a hoax. Can you take some time to give us an overview of how the right-wing movement has used the COVID-19 pandemic as an organizing issue to further their larger agenda of white supremacy?
Okay, thank you so much, Fee, for that wonderful introduction and for your comments, because I think they're really important. And I'm very happy to be here and be a part of this conversation. So to answer your question, first of all, I think as opposed to a unified right-wing movement, I think there are a variety of different kinds of groups involved in the movement, including conservative Republicans and Trump supporters like Betsy DeVos. But there are also some extreme right-wing activists like the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloos, who we saw in the Capitol on January 6th. And some of these groups began to organize protests against COVID-19 public health measures in the first months of the pandemic. And some of their goals, stated goals of these groups, were to resist public safety measures as an infringement on their constitutional rights. The Second Amendment, defenders of the Second Amendment, gun owners are sort of a paradigm of that kind of model. However, implicitly, the protests also provided a platform for right-wing activists known as accelerants who want to use these protests to help create massive social disruption and a kind of civil war, race war that would help to destroy the present society with the expectation that a new society would form, allowing members to enjoy the white privilege and dominance, that they hope to recapture by belonging to these groups. And so, for example, the protest against Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan on April 30th was a prime example of this kind of protest. So they were carrying gun rifles, Confederate flags, and nooses, and stormed the state capitol. And the protesters compared Whitmer to Adolf Hitler. They showed nooses, and some of their signs said, "Tyrants get the rope." So, in addition, commentators have suggested that the perception that was emerging during those months that COVID-19 was going to primarily hit people of color helped fuel these movements. Some, people have looked at the fact that these protests were very white, and that they came about as the news that there were these major health inequities and disparities. And so Black, brown, and indigenous people were getting hit hardest. And so people were aware that ending lockdowns was going to cause more infections and deaths, but they didn't feel that they were going to pay the price. Conservative billionaires also helped support these movements and provided them with resources. So this kind of specter of white supremacy, militarism, threats of violence against elected officials was evident in protests across the country. This wasn't confined to Michigan. Illinois, Wisconsin, Mississippi, a number of places around the country. And these protests and the online spaces where right-wing groups would mingle provided avenues for cross-pollination of ideas, for radicalizing and recruiting new members. So for example, there were 962 new right-wing Facebook groups protesting COVID-19 stay-at-home orders between May and August of 2020, with up to 3 million members. So this is a vast movement. So as somebody in public health, watching this, being incredibly concerned about what was going to happen to our country, what was happening to people of color, it was just amazing to see these kinds of fringe policies influencing national policy and our national response to COVID. And so I began asking myself what could possibly be going on. And research that's been coming out in California, and sort of watching Trump's behavior during this process, what people have begun to realize is that the fringe represented by right-wing activists became sort of the center of our response, our public health response coming from the White House, because in Trump's desire to get reelected, he recognized or felt that these people were going to be a very, very important base for him to be reelected. And so there was almost a dialectic between Trump and the right wing in that they helped influence some of the policies that he adopted, which refused to take COVID-19 seriously. He tweeted support for these kinds of protests. And so I think, one of the critical things here is to understand how Trump's desire to be reelected, with him as the head of the Republican Party and his great influence on Republican governors and legislators, helped bring these kinds of protests and the ideas behind these protests and the ideology of white supremacy into the White House and diffused to the American public, and as one of the primary influences on the U.S. response to COVID-19. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that overview, Denise. That was really helpful in setting the stage for this conversation. And one of the things that you mentioned that I think it's important for us to all acknowledge is that this is a diffuse movement, and it's something that's happening across our country, and I identified ways in which it's playing out in Georgia. And so I do want to bring a couple of other people, our two other panelists, into the conversation to talk about how this is playing out in their regions. And so it is my pleasure to introduce y'all to our other two panelists that we have with us this evening. I'll start with Skye Allen. Skye Allen is the Special Projects Manager for Inland Empowerment in the San Bernardino and Riverside counties of Southern California. Born, raised, and educated in the region, she strives to empower communities to fight for what they need by challenging institutional systems and chipping away at structural issues at the local level to change policy. In her current role, Skye fosters relationships with local government officials partner organizations and institutions to bolster civic engagement. And I did ask Sky to name a woman she'd like to thank today, and she would like to thank Veronica or Vero Alvarado from the Warehouse Worker Resource Center for being an awesome boss, mentor, and friend. Vero helped Sky see, and she continues to show her, that above all, organizing is a labor of love for your community. I totally agree. And that change happens from the ground up. Veronica was also Sky's guide into organizing, and Sky says that she's better because of how Veronica mentored and supported her. So welcome, Sky.
Thank you so much for having me. Honored to be here.
Great. And then the other panelist I'd like to introduce is Art Reyes III, who is the founding executive director of We the People Michigan. He was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, and hails from 3 generations of proud UAW members. He spent much of 2016 working in Flint, responding to the water crisis, and helped launch Flint Rising. Before that, he led Michigan Voice, which is a statewide civic engagement organization. And Art would like to use his time today to honor an unsung hero of the 1937 Flint sit-down strike. Her name is Jenora Johnson. When police gas-bombed the factories and opened fire on workers, Jenora Johnson, who was 23 years old at the time, took the mic on the sound truck and said, "Cowards, cowards, shooting unarmed and defensive men. Women of Flint, this is your fight. Join the picket line and defend your jobs, your husband's jobs, and your children's home." She then went on to found the Women's Emergency Brigade, which is a militant vanguard organization that played a key role in winning the Flint sit-down strike, which was one of the most important labor movement victories in U.S. history. So welcome, Art, and thank you for giving us that interesting piece of history. All right. So glad to have both of you here with us. My question for both of you, and you can take it in either order, but can you tell us how the far right has used the COVID-19 pandemic and their anti-government rhetoric to grab the headlines and recruit followers in California and Michigan, respectively? And again, you can take that in whatever order you'd like.
I can start that one. So I think when people think of California, they tend to think super progressive, super blue, everything is super left there, and that's kind of the predominant narrative. And if you live here and if you've spent a substantial amount of time in California, you'll know that the reality is far more complex. Nothing is that simple, that black or white. The same rhetoric that fires up far right-wingers, white supremacists in Georgia fires them up in Michigan, fires them up in California, and everywhere in the country. Especially as you come further inward in California, things get, ideology is quite diverse. People have lots of different opinions, lots of different beliefs, and we see the same sorts of things happening in our communities as well. One really clear example I can offer you all is that there is a petition right now to recall the governor, Governor Newsom in the state of California. And even though my region, the Inland Empire, which again is San Bernardino and Riverside counties, a little bit east of Los Angeles and Orange County, even though we only have 10% of the registered voters in the state, 20% of the signatures to recall the governor come from our region. So that just gives you a little bit of perspective that things are not, ideology is not even all across the state, and really radical extremism can appeal to people all over the country. A slew of anti-science folks show up to local board of supervisor meetings and spew conspiracy theories, anti-science rhetoric, anti-mask rhetoric, and often blatant racism and bigotry against Black people, against Asian people, against people with disabilities, against people who they feel farm workers, warehouse workers, the list goes on and on. There's no shortage of bigotry and racism and other isms that we see and hear and feel from our neighbors when it comes to the fear mongering and the way that they've been antagonized, especially over the past 4 years. The unfortunate part about that is it's not just a handful of protesters, right? The Riverside County Sheriff, Chad Bianco, and one of the Riverside County Supervisors, Jeff Hewitt, refused to uphold CDC guidelines, often mock them, praise people in organizations who don't follow them, and openly kind of encourage this sort of behavior to continue in the community. And they're not alone, of course. There are unfortunately, other elected officials who follow suit, but those are the first two that come to mind. And it's really harmful to the majority of the community who's trying to follow the guidelines, follow the rules, trust that their government is there to protect them. And even though, the majority of us still do believe those things, it is still harmful to have this sort of rhetoric and action happening in our communities. So I'll pass the mic to Art so he can talk a little bit what that looks like in Michigan.
Thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Guy. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Oh, you might have frozen.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Sky. I really appreciated hearing that, and thank you for the introduction. So again, my name is Art Reyes, and I'm going to just share a little bit of the context in Michigan. But just first, I think it's important to zoom out a little bit as we look at the context that we're in, right now in a state like Michigan. So, for me, my family wound up in Michigan in the 1940s and 50s as migrant workers from South Texas. And for them, they came to Flint for jobs in the auto factories because it represented, it was a beacon of hope for working people. It was a place where, you could come, could have decent wages and be able to provide for a family and be treated with dignity. As I was growing up, I was born, my parents were in high school in the 80s, and it was the beginning of a shift in Michigan, where Flint actually went from the 1950s, the highest per capita income city in the country for a brief period, to today, the single poorest city in the United States. And when we look at that shift, and then some of the context that happened afterward, particularly as we saw kind of an onslaught of neoliberal economic policies that really ravaged many of our communities in a place like Michigan, what we've seen over the past few decades is that as we've seen significant economic devastation in many communities, we've also seen a corporate conservative infrastructure that has seized upon that and that has really used that to amass political power and wealth. So just contextually, when we look at Michigan is one of the most segregated places in the United States. As a whole, we're between 75 and 80% white. Our largest city, by far our largest city, is the city of Detroit, which is 90+% people of color. It's over 80% Black. And when we have communities like Detroit, Flint, where I grew up, Pontiac, Benton Harbor, who have experienced multi-generational economic devastation, they're virtually entirely cities of color, predominantly Black cities. But then also we have places like the Upper Peninsula, a very rural part of the state, which by some accounts has been in an economic recession since 1992. We've been very fertile ground for divide and conquer politics that have told some communities in pain the reason for your pain is because of other communities in pain. And so we've seen a willingness of political actors and wealthy donors. So folks like, Denise mentioned earlier, Betsy DeVos. The DeVosses have put hundreds of millions of dollars into the state of Michigan into reshaping our politics and into really doubling down on a divide and conquer politics rooted in dog whistle racism. So when we look at all of the context around what's happening, the kind of pretext for what we've seen in Michigan this year that has made all over national news with, white supremacists storming the Capitol, there's been kind of a long on-ramp for this. And there's been many political and corporate actors in the state who are complicit in this. And I think it's really important to lift that up because it didn't emerge out of nowhere. And it has also emerging out of a politics that has been enabling pretty extreme right wing and white nationalist policies, but also one that has allowed kind of naked austerity policies that have impacted communities like Flint, where I grew up, that led to things like the Flint water crisis. So I just want to set some of that background context for when we think about then when we come to COVID. And for me, I think it's really important just to set a little bit of the context of what this year's looked like. I want to paint a picture of a split screen for you on April 30th. On one side, we had a violent foreshadow. A few dozen armed white nationalists stormed our state capitol, attempting to force their way into the chambers where our elected officials were meeting. Men with long rifles stood in the gallery, looming above our state senators. But that same day, a very different but equally foreshadowing gathering was happening online via Zoom. Folks from every corner of the state, Black, white, brown, Native, newcomer, held a people's telethon for 8 hours. It was Black and brown folks in Detroit sharing poetry, mourning loved ones they had lost that month due to the COVID crisis. It was white and Native people in rural communities and undocumented people in Michigan talking about the mutual aid efforts that were happening, where our people were taking care of their neighbors and their communities. And 21,000 people turned out online to that as we called our elected representatives, demanding an end to water shutoffs, to evictions, fighting for the release of incarcerated loved ones who were at highest risk of getting COVID. So on one side, you saw a violent racist backlash, and that was the story that predominated all over the media nationally. What did not was this other story that is a really critical one, which was working class people fighting for their communities and for each other. And I think we'll probably have more room to talk about that, but I think it's really important to not overblow the broadness of what these kind of very dangerous, increasingly violent white nationalist fringes that we have in a place like Michigan, right, that have been here longstanding. That, for example, as many folks know, had an attempt to kidnap and execute our governor thwarted just several months ago over the summer. But what we've also seen is the emergence of really strong, really committed, multiracial working class organizing is actually showing up and countering that in really, really important ways. And we can talk about that a little bit more later, but I think it's a really important point for us to be raising, because we should not give the folks who storm the Capitol with guns more credit than what is due, than the organizers who are working class folks who are fighting every single day in places like the Upper Peninsula, who are standing shoulder to shoulder with our folks in Flint and Detroit and Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo and all over the place.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I think you both made such important points, including the point that you made that this has been a long time coming, and the COVID-19 pandemic is just ignited something that was already brewing. And both of you sort of raised the point that we have political leaders in every state, I think, who are enabling this to happen. And Sky, I just have to mention that as somebody who lives in Georgia and has a lot of friends in California, I do appreciate you taking a nuanced view of California and saying that it's not, everything's not rosy and progressive over there either. All right. I do just want to encourage our audience to put in any questions that you may have in the chat. But if there are no questions right now, then I'll go ahead and move on to the next question. And this question is actually for all of the panelists. And I think I'll start first with Denise. What is your take on how successful this movement is? How successful has the far right movement been in eroding our confidence in science and government and impeding the response to COVID-19 and the economic recovery? I'll start with let's start with Denise, and then we'll move to Sky, and then end with Art for that.
Okay, yeah, thanks so much for asking that question. It's a great one. I think I'll probably talk a little bit more about health in this. And unfortunately, especially as I said, from my vantage point as someone in public health, I think the impact on on the COVID response nationally has been terrible. I mean, there we have over 500 deaths. We have millions of people infected with COVID, and I have colleagues that are physicians and people that practice public health, and it's been shocking to us that a country that supposedly is advanced as the U.S. has had this kind of experience. And so I think that we can see the success of the right wing's influence with a president who has refused to wear masks, who has served as a role model for not wearing a mask, organized and participated in super spreader events. I'd say aside from being a role model, so much misinformation has been shared in social media and the conservative media. A recent study from Cornell University found that Trump was the single largest transmitter of misinformation surrounding COVID-19. And one of the researchers said, the president's social media presence is the tip of an iceberg with an entire amplification ecosystem of right-wing media, influencers, and outright conspiracy theorists making up the bulk below. And so some of the kinds of things that, Trump has said and, misinformation about were, at one point he said that children were almost immune to COVID-19. He suggested that injecting bleach or disinfectants could be used to kill COVID-19 germs. And he's repeatedly reduced the notion that COVID-19 is a serious disease, and sometimes compared it to, nothing more than the flu. In addition, he minimized the role of public health experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci in the White House. And so removed, scientific advice and counsel that could have helped guide the country in a more positive direction around COVID. And in addition, echoing some of the points that I think Sky was making, there have been numerous threats and criticisms of public health officers across the country, not only Governor Whitmer, but in California alone. In the first 6 months of the pandemic, I think there were at least 6 health officers around the state that left their posts, and there were really serious death threats against the Orange County health officers. So I think, to the extent that we might be anticipating our 4th surge of the virus, and we have had devastating amount of illness and death throughout the country, with the majority borne by people of color. I think to that extent, the right wing has been very successful in creating public health policies that have not helped us effectively deal with coronavirus, especially given the role of the U.S. in terms of having so many resources and so much advanced medical technology.
Thank you for that, Denise. Sky, do you want to answer the question next?
Yeah, sure. I definitely have to echo a lot of what has just been shared. Again, I think this answer is a bit nuanced as well. To start with the good news, I don't think that they have been successful in shifting public opinion, right? For the most part, people believe the science. They believe that COVID is real. They believe that we need to wear masks, and they're doing those things, right? They're wearing their mask. They're keeping their distance. They're trying to stay home as much as possible. They're washing their hands, all of those things. And that matters. That makes a difference. It's It's important that people still believe the science and follow the science to the best of all of our ability. The other side of this, though, is that they have been successful at changing the narrative, and regardless of the best actions of the majority of us, the minority of folks who are creating this chaos and raising this havoc are keeping all of us unsafe. The actions of people to spew disinformation, to spew misinformation, to promote anti-science, anti-mask, anti-government sentiment is making all of our communities less safe, and brought us to a point in part where 500,000 of our community members are gone, right? And that's not nothing. That's really meaningful. That's really devastating. And that's a huge problem for us in the moment and in the long term to figure out how to address. For us locally in the Inland Empire, much of our local government has shielded away from following the CDC guidelines as aggressively as they may have otherwise because of the pressure that right-wing folks had put on them to not be so aggressive. And the majority of organizations who were engaged in the work were really focused on directly supporting people in need, trying to connect them with resources, trying to, connect people to food banks, to unemployment insurance or new jobs, all of these other sorts of activities. And meanwhile, right-wing extremists and white supremacists were just organizing hard and going to every single city council meeting, board of supervisor meeting, anything they could go to say, this isn't real, this isn't happening, we shouldn't be wearing masks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in doing so, they appealed to the most cynical and self-interested instincts of many of our elected officials and given them an excuse to not do what the majority of us know that they should be doing. And that's really dangerous. And like I said, that is violent on all of us and is something that we're really going to have to figure out how to address.
Thank you, Sky. How about you, Art? Has the far right movement been successful in eroding confidence in science and impeding our government's response to COVID-19?
I appreciate the question. I think when we look at it both in terms of COVID, but also in terms of the prospect of an actual, real, multiracial democracy, for me, I deeply believe, and I want to unequivocally say, they are losing. And I think that is really important. Like, they are losing. And I want to share a couple of reasons why I think that, but also it is requisite that we're proactive and forceful in our organizing against that, because that can change. But I think what I described a bit earlier around some of these flashpoint moments, and again, I do think April 30th is a really critical moment for kind of drawing out the contrast of kind of the two narratives in Michigan, particularly in 2020. One that was really driven by some violent rhetoric by white nationalists, very aggressively targeting our governor. And in particular, that was initially stoked by political opportunists on the right who were really seeking to attack the governor, whose kind of political stock was rising. But when we saw that happening, and then we saw this massive multiracial response. But the multiracial response on that continued to play out over the course of the year. And this is why I think it's really important to unequivocally say, like, the right and the white nationalists are losing, right? So a couple of things. One, we had record turnout in Michigan. And this was not about any candidate. This is about our communities showing up at the ballot box and stating at the ballot box that Black Lives Matter, that no human being is illegal, that water is life, not a commodity, that all of us deserve dignity, especially in the midst of a global pandemic. And so, we had right-wing forces that came and very forcefully attempted to undermine the election in Michigan, driving a racist strategy that was seen to disenfranchise Black and brown folks in Detroit specifically. But the thing is we were ready. We out-organized them. That thousands of people from every corner of the state, from tiny rural towns as far northwest as you can go in the state of Michigan, up in the Upper Peninsula, to our biggest cities like Detroit, stood together. Folks took action in the streets, organized their people to speak truth to elected officials. All of these things, like this was really important and happening. And that organizers and a mass of multiracial working class people fought tooth and nail to defeat attempts to undermine our democracy, that were coming from the highest office in the land, and we won. We prevailed. But I think what's really important is that that's not done. Like, the reason that we had some of these victories, the reason that we're continuing to make advances in fighting COVID, the reason that we've been able to push some of these back is because we've seen working class folks, everyday folks, Black, white, brown, Native, newcomer, across communities coming together and organizing together. Now, what is really important in this moment, I believe, is that we are both organizing and pushing newly elected leaders to say, you better actually deliver for working people, especially in the midst of a global pandemic, where our people need health care, where they need money, where folks need wages, the jobs that actually pay sustainable wages. Like, that newly elected folks better deliver for working people if we actually want to continue winning in this. And that too, we actually have to be holding those who are complicit in this accountable. And I want to mention one thing on this before I shift. So in Michigan, right, during the kind of post-election phase, where we saw an incredible amount of disinformation coming at us, we saw an incredible amount of threats of violence directed at our organizers and our people all over the state. When our people prevailed, stood together, showed up over and over and over again until we won, and we were able to protect the results of the election in that moment. There are still a lot of elected officials that are complicit, that were spreading disinformation, that signed on to the Texas lawsuit that was attempting to disenfranchise millions of voters, that voted not to certify the election. And because of all of the work that we did during the post-election period, built action councils all over the state. There were rural communities, Black and brown folks in places like Detroit and Grand Rapids and Lansing and Washtenaw County and Benton Harbor, but also in all of these rural communities across the state. Well, those rural communities are represented by some of the folks that are complicit. And so right now there's an effort called Defund Bergman, that a number of rural organizers in northern Michigan, who are represented by Jack Bergman in Michigan's 1st congressional district, who has continued to spread disinformation, who's entrenched, that we've seen some of these folks in some of these communities completely entrenched. And if they're not held accountable, and if we're not both demanding actual bold action that delivers for working people from newly elected folks, but also holding people accountable who are complicit in that, then the wave of some of the white nationalism, of rising fascism, that tide will return. And it's our duty to continue combating that. And the way that we do that is by organizing, by continuing to build the multiracial democracy that this country has never yet realized, but I believe deeply is possible if our communities are continuing to drive that work.
Thank you for that, Art. And I think Denise wanted to respond to you.
And I definitely agree with you that we have not lost that. In fact, I know there's a lot of grassroots organizing. And in fact, I think that's where the strength has been. I mean, I've seen at the local level here in San Francisco, community groups in the Mission and in the Fruitvale have been coming together, and they've been demanding. First, it was testing resources for people, because there was a claim that people wouldn't be interested in being tested. And of course, once people formed coalitions with city government and with a local medical school, and they found that tons of Latinx people in the Mission were getting tested. Now they're organizing around treatment, around vaccines, around social services. So I think those efforts have been really strong. And I happen to have relatives both because I did some time in San Bernardino. I graduated from Eisenhower High School in Rialto. And I've got sisters in Oklahoma, so I've got family in red states and in red areas, and they're very aware. And we've had people countering those conservative governments, and they're very aware that they need to social distance and mask, and they've been upset about these orders. But and I do think, given that as you said, the power of the people, we have new people in the White House, and so I think things are starting to happen, and I know we get a chance to talk about that a little bit more, but I'm just thinking about in terms of the influence of the right wing, primarily because it became orchestrated through the White House and had an enormous impact on public health, and much more impact than I think it would have had otherwise. And so I think that's my point, is that when you get, the leader of the Republican Party, supposedly the leader of one of the most important countries in the world, who does not model what you need to do to contain a pandemic like this, that you end up with a death toll that didn't need to happen. You end up with massive levels of infection. And in this area, we've suffered some severe economic crises. I mean, unhoused people, unemployment and things like that. So I don't want to diminish the real important truths you're talking about, but just from the standpoint of what other countries where there wasn't science denial, where there was immediate recognition that we need to, people need to mask up, we need to, follow shelter in place, and the fact that that greatly diminished the health and the economic toll, the toll on the country. So that was just my point, and I certainly didn't want to imply that, we don't have a lot of fire, and we don't have a lot of there's not a lot of organizing, because I think the organizing has what's helped communities of color, because we have been left out of the broader, we've been left out of the health system in so many different ways, that if it weren't for the community organizations, the organizing, and the churches that have been really central to this effort, that things would have been even worse. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you, Denise. And I think you're both making excellent points. And, I think the other thing I would say, sort of in response to what Art brought up, is we're not losing. And I think that's part of why we are seeing this surge in white supremacy, because, I don't mean to put this crudely, but one of my friends and colleagues and a fellow social justice advocate in Georgia on the issue of voter suppression, she said to me one time, we're winning, and you see it because a dying donkey kicks the hardest. And so I think that's why we are seeing in Georgia our state elected officials going very hard in trying to undermine democracy and challenging and trying to delegitimize the election results, and really trying to tamp down on people's voting rights, because they are losing, and it's a fight for power. I think I would love to hear a question from the audience if we have any. All right, we have a question from Kim Clark. And the question is, what were the demographics of the vaccine trials? Do we know what percentage of those part of the trials were people of color, or was supremacy present there too? Thank you for the question, Kim. And do any of our panelists want to volunteer to take that question? If you know.
Sky, I can just say something. I just heard one of the professors in our school that works on infectious disease, and I don't know about the racial composition. I think when they're looking at something like the vaccine trials, they were mostly looking at gender and age, that those were the primary criteria, because biologically there shouldn't be differences and how the vaccine would react. So I think those were the two main categories, but I'm not at all sure.
All right, it looks like we have another question from Kinji Ridley. Kinji asks, how do you all think misinformation about COVID and relaxed mask mandates are going to affect the rollout of the vaccine in the future? Anybody want to
I
take
guess I can. Yeah, I guess I can start that, and my colleagues can add to it if there's things that I miss. But I think what at least I'm seeing in my community so far is, there are people who still feel a type of way about the vaccine, aren't trustful of it for a variety of different reasons potentially, and maybe aren't interested in signing up immediately. But a majority of the community is really anxious to get vaccinated and to be able to quote unquote go back to normal and resume some sort of normalcy and not have the fear of the pandemic weighing on them as it has been for the past year. So at this point, the demand for the vaccine far exceeds the supply, and that's going to remain the same for the next couple of months. So I don't know that misinformation about maybe the vaccine in particular is going to change the rollout of the vaccine, because what we've been seeing so far is people are really eager to get it. As the vaccine, covers more and more people, we may get to a point where it's harder to reach that quote unquote herd immunity level, because if we don't reach a certain amount of people who do sign up, and that's a problem for later if we get to that point. But in terms of mass mandates, I think that's similar to what we've already been experiencing the past year, and we already have some exposure to what that looks like. The response from our elected officials is unfortunately quite various, and different elected officials in different positions of power at different levels of government have different responses to how to enforce CDC guidelines in their community, whether it be their city, their county, their state, etc. And I think the people who are following the science, who have been watching articles or news, or as much information as they can get over the past few years, will wear a mask as long as leaders like Dr. Fauci and other leaders continue to say, wear a mask even if you're vaccinated to protect your community. And we're just going to do the best that we can to share the proper information, and people will respond to that as they can. And we will continue to push our elected officials to reflect us in the best way possible. So that's how I would think to address the question raised.
Thank you, Sky. And I do actually want to move us on to the next question, because I think that something in Sky's response sort of gets us heading down this direction. But we know that institutions of medical science and the government have at times in our past and currently have been extremely abusive with women of color, the Black community, Indigenous communities, and other communities of color. And that can undermine trust in things like the vaccine. And so what I want to ask the panelists are, what are some of the challenges that you've encountered related to this in your effort to galvanize a pro-science racial justice movement, and how successful have you been in addressing some of these challenges within communities of color? And let's start first maybe with Art.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm sorry, having a little bit of audio issues.
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Okay. So look, I think sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble. The audio was a little choppy when you were asking the question, so I'm going to pick up what pieces of it I caught, and then maybe someone else, and I'm happy to loop back. I just missed some of the question, but look, I think for us, most fundamentally, like there are significant issues of trust that we actually have to be rebuilding very deeply in our communities. I know that very, very deeply, coming from a place like Flint, where the public trust was broken in a very devastating way. And so it's actually really important that we're working very deliberately to rebuild trust within our communities. But the other side of that is accountability, and actually making sure that we have institutions that are acting in the best interests of our communities. And quite frankly, for many, many, many years, they have not been. We've seen massive disinvestment in our public health infrastructure. We've seen massive disinvestment in particularly within communities of color, but not just in communities of color. And so as we've seen a lot of the erosion of our ability our ability to care for the public, there's been narratives that have been able to seize upon that, pitting our communities against one another, further eroding that trust. And so I think right now in this moment, what is really critical is that we're focused on rebuilding trust, but that it has to be done through a lens of power. And it actually is important that multiracial working class communities, that marginalized communities, are actively building power to make demands on our institutions to actually serve us, particularly for folks that are in government right now. So yeah, I hope that captured at least part of your question. Apologies for my internet issues.
That's okay. Thank you for your response. And Denise, you want to take this question next, and I'm happy to repeat it if you need me to.
Sure. Thanks, Fee. And I want to agree with Art that we certainly those atrocities in the past, including Tuskegee and, sterilization abuse and so forth, are influences people's perceptions about, institutions. But I think he really hit a very important point when he said, that trust needs to be rebuilt, and there needs to be accountability, and through public health, through medicine. So I would agree with that. And I would add that I think one of the issues for me is that people want to talk about vaccine, quote, hesitancy and not mistrust, but to say that is that's the main impediment to people getting vaccinated. And I don't think that's the main reason why we're not seeing equity in terms of vaccination rates. For one thing, there's some research that just came out showing that white Republicans are much more likely to be vaccine hesitant, like 56% of those surveyed compared to 31% of African Americans expressed, concerns about getting the vaccine. But the other thing is that vaccine equity is a part of healthcare equity. And for many reasons, we know that people of color are not experiencing the same levels. And if you look at something like what determines who's getting the vaccine, people that are employed with good jobs with insurance that can take time off from work to go get the vaccine, or stay for hours on the internet. There's less digital access and so forth. So those are the nexus of factors that have long contributed to health inequity, and they're shaping the access to the vaccines right now.
I really appreciate that response, Denise. And are there any ways that you've been trying to address that inequity in your work?
Well, the media has been really interested in vaccine hesitancy. And I've done maybe 3 or 4 interviews about that. And of course, for many of us working in this field, these are not new issues. And we understood that there was going to be equity access issues around the vaccine. So I think through talking with the media and trying to help them to reframe the issue, and trying to help them understand why it is that, whites are 2 to 3 times more likely to get vaccinated, that even when vaccine centers have been set up in communities of color, they're flooded with whites coming in, taking up vaccination slots. So I would say that right now that's the kind of work that I'm trying to do primarily with the media.
That's important, really important work to be doing, is I think just reclaiming that narrative. Sky, do you want to address this issue?
Sure, absolutely. And I think what Denise brought up is really important is that the conversation around false narratives and the conversation about failing institutions are kind of two separate things, not always, but in the way that we're talking about it in this moment, in this way, they're slightly separate, right? And I think it's important to separate those things out a little bit. The conversation around false narratives really ties a lot into the deliberate disinformation that we were talking about before, and the push for anti-mass, anti-science, saying COVID is a hoax and all of those sorts of things. That's a kind of more disinformation that we can clearly identify and point out as deliberate bad actors. Institutions failing our communities, that's a much broader issue. That's a much deeper issue. That's a much longer issue. But we know that when we talk with our communities, that the same people who were failed by the institutions in the past and the ways that have been mentioned before are also the people that are disproportionately impacted by COVID right now. So there is this balance of that maybe there is some hesitancy potentially around a vaccine that is fairly new that people don't have a ton of information about, generally speaking, but there's also direct harm and violence from a pandemic that has taken away so many of our loved ones, that has kept us from being safe at work or being able to go to work at our normal capacities and do other daily living sorts of activities. And I think because of all of those factors, the vaccine hesitancy, as was just raised, is less of an issue than the disinformation, the deliberate disinformation campaign that's been happening simultaneously. So in terms of, what we're doing about it at the local level is really focusing on the logistics of the moment, right? Last year was really focusing on how do we protect our communities that are impacted disproportionately or otherwise, right? How do we ensure that those people have food on the table? How do we ensure that they stay in their homes? How do they ensure that they don't lose their jobs or are able to still pay for the things that they need to pay for should they lose their jobs? How do we support them to get access to hand sanitizer and mask and the likes? Now it's about how do we work with our public health to try to make the logistics more equitable so that people in marginalized communities, people in disproportionately affected communities get equitable access to the vaccine as people with resources and money and power. And addressing those things are, direct communication and trying to figure out the logistics and support that work. It's serving as that trusted messenger with the community and saying that we can trust this, and this is what the research is, this is what the science is, this is what we know. And let's learn about these things together. Let's explore all of these things together and bring community with you as you're going through this process. And it's constantly learning, right? In the beginning, we really focused, like I said, on the logistics of it and kind of ignored the disinformation. And a year into this, we realized that you can't just ignore it. It's been there. It's only growing. We have to tackle it head on and push correct information and actively work to steer people away from the active disinformation campaigns that are happening. But regardless, really focusing on the equity indicators and the logistical pieces of doing the work to ensure that things are equitable moving forward.
Thank you, Sky, and thank you, both of you, for really addressing the issue of vaccine inequity in a way that really highlights all of the factors that are at play there and that aren't because of hesitancy within communities of color. Why don't we turn again to the audience and see if they have any questions for y'all? All right, we have one question. What interventions are you all looking towards? What interventions are you all looking towards to address how the right misinforms and radicalizes online specifically, whether it's a policy or community defense, education, or other solutions? And let's start with Denise.
You put me on the spot, Fee.
I can switch if you want a bit more
Um,
about it.
I think it's a great question. And yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think our change in the White House, I think that having, um, you know, some of the social media channels are being much more careful in what kind of information they're allowing to be publicized on through their channels is going to help. Um, but I think this is something that definitely needs to be dealt with, and I'd be really interested to hear what Sky and Art have to say about this.
Let's hear from them. Sky, do you want to take it?
Sure. Yeah, like I said, we're still like being students in this, right? And trying to learn from our community and learn from online platforms of what's working and what isn't, but really experimenting and pushing folks online where they are in Facebook groups, on Twitter, on Instagram, and posting not just factual information in the terms of graphics and infographics and things of that nature, but really talking about communal responses to the vaccine, right? Saying, in the Inland Empire, we look out for our community, and I wear a mask to ensure that you are safe as much as I am, right? Really talking about how do we make this issue that wasn't supposed to be political that became political. How can we make it personal again? How can we make it about you and me and my neighborhood and our community and protecting each other and what that requires and what that looks like? And can we chip away at the fear mongering and the extremism and the polarization that has come out of the COVID conversation, and just making it about you and me, our community, and protecting one another? How can we do that through video? How can we do that through pictures? How can we do that through graphics? What works, what doesn't? Can we push that out there? Can we share it as much as possible? And can we start chipping away at the way that this extremism and radicalization has happened online, especially since that's one of the safest ways that we can experiment right now when it's still not entirely safe to be out in the public doing that.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I really appreciate that, Sky. I do think that ultimately the solutions to this have to be rooted within our communities. And I think for me, a really important principle and for us right now is that the antidote to disinformation isn't more information, it's relationship. It's relationship, and it is also making sure that we're explicitly building multiracial democracy. So I think for us, as we saw this, one of the kind of interventions specifically to your question, Emnet, is we just got done running in 2020 a 14 county deep canvas program in rural, suburban, and urban counties. And what this was it was about having kind of real, honest, long form conversations with people that were seeking to begin an opening for a relationship, right? We're beginning to get a sense of how people were doing, what was going on in their community, and really beginning to actually establish an emotional connection with people. And I think that's really important for how we combat disinformation, because the disinformation waves that we've seen move incredibly rapidly. They've been really, really hard to combat. But the best way to do that is to actually be making sure that we're rebuilding a sense of public, that we're rebuilding civil society and rebuilding some of the connections within our community necessary to be moving forward. So I think for us, it has been incredibly important that we're really focusing on targeting some of the communities that are susceptible to disinformation, and making sure that we're building relationships, and also, quite frankly, that we're being really explicit about race and about class. I think that is incredibly important, as we continue to do the work, particularly in places like Michigan.
Thank you for the question, Ibnet. And I'm actually sorry to put you on the spot a little bit, Art, but I do have just a follow-up question to your answer, which is, how do we build relationship right now when many of us are isolated and are not able to organize in the traditional ways that we're able to? How do we build relationship in this moment?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I think it's a really important one. So, look, I think for us, what that looked like in a number of cases, right? So, a deep canvas program that we did, we ended up doing over the phone. We ended up doing and making phone calls with people who actually, in the midst of the pandemic, were actually really willing to have conversations with people that were asking real questions, and that were actually concerned about their well-being. That was really important. I think the other thing that is really important, and this is especially for the organizers out there, in my opinion, there is kind of a consultant class that has attempted to dominate the digital space, right? That by digital, what digital organizing means is spending a lot of money on consultants and paid ads that can micro-target our communities. But what is really important is that we're actually seeing digital as a realm. It's a space that our people are, and we need to actually be meeting our people where they're at, and same as we would be organizing, actually beginning to build relationships with people as human beings, as agents, as people who care deeply about their family and community, and not just as data points. And for me, this is really important because we've seen, for us, we with Kairos, that is an amazing organization that really focuses a lot on digital organizing. Here in Michigan, we ended up building digital squads during the period of really heightened disinformation in Michigan around the election. And what that was focused on, actually focusing on your networks, your relationships. What are the stories that people need to be told? How are we actually building the connection with people individually and moving them where there is relationships, where there's human connection, and where we can be building those in that space, as opposed to the kind of broad blanket that I think, quite frankly, from my perspective, has really plagued the kind of civic engagement space more broadly in progressive circles, that is treating our people like data points, like bodies, like numbers. And so it is really important that we're focusing on engaging our people as people wherever that they are. And right now, particularly in the context of the pandemic, our people are online. And it's been really important that we've been finding those spaces to still do the story work necessary, do the one-on-one work that's necessary. And there's actually a whole lot of potential for us to be doing that in very real ways.
Thank you, Art. All right. I do have another question for our panelists here. And this is my last question for y'all. And then if we have time, maybe we can take another question from the audience. But my question to you is, under the Biden-Harris administration, what are the hopeful signs and the new challenges we face in ensuring a racially just response to the pandemic and an expanded democracy? Anybody want to go first? So I'm not putting people on the spot.
I'm happy to start that one. I think I would say kind of break it up into two ways for me personally. I would say that symbolism matters, but policy matters more. Right. And that would be kind of like my short response to it. I'm really excited that we now have leadership in the White House that doesn't fuel the flames of white supremacy, and that has a strategy around COVID, around many of the other issues that we care about and are dedicated to. As a Black woman, it matters to me that a lot of people in federal government now look like me that didn't before, and that speak to people that look like me and people that don't look like me openly and as honestly as they can and as often as they can. I think that really matters. And I also think it matters that that they give platitudes and speeches that are progressive, that do speak to the needs of our communities, that are community driven, and that's really important. That's really meaningful. However, as I said at the beginning, policy matters more, right? It matters that not only you look like me, but that you fight for me, that you look like my neighbor, but you fight for my neighbor. We need action behind the words as well. And you know, we've only been in this place for a little over a month now, about a month and a half. So I'll give it a beat to see if that policy comes to the table and is passed and implemented in ways that benefit our communities. But all of our problems weren't just created out of thin air and arose in the last 4 years, right? They are deep issues that were exacerbated, but were born long ago. And it's going to take more than 1 month. It's going to take more than a year. It's going to take more than 4 years to undo all of the damage that's happened over the centuries that we've existed as a country. But it's important that the people in charge right now take that head on and do what they can do in a month, in a year, in 4 years to tackle those things to the best of their ability. So I'm really expecting, I know my community is really expecting, I know our organizations are really expecting people to fight as hard as they're speaking about fighting and really show that they're committed to doing the work, as committed as we are to doing the work and protecting our communities and building a better future. That's a lot of work, and I'm measuring my expectations, but I'm also really hopeful that we will achieve meaningful growth in the next couple of years, because I do think that people that are now tasked with delivering that change are committed to a degree to doing it. But I do think that it's important that we continue to push and ensure that the policy matches the symbols.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. And then Art or Denise, which one of you wants to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to go. So I think there's an awful lot of hope, echoing what Sky was saying. You know, the changes in the White House, I think, are tremendous. And, you know, just in Biden's first 2 days in office, he issued so many executive orders that are going to have a positive impact on COVID. I mean, he's requiring, you know, mask and physical distancing on federal property and transportation, you know, measures to improve access to care, you know, measures to improve the public health supply chain. I think there were like 13 executive orders on healthcare and COVID alone. And in addition, there's measures to improve economic relief, to help. He's accepted the Paris Climate Agreement. He's joined the WHO, improvements in immigration policy. So I think there's a lot of reason to be very hopeful, with, even though the time in office has been very limited, they've done a tremendous amount of work to do what they can with executive orders. And even more recently, Biden used his presidential power. I think it's the Defense Production Act, to get 2 vaccine manufacturers to coordinate so that we'll have more vaccine out there. And it looks like he's going to exceed the expectations for the vaccine rollout. So I think in terms of the pandemic itself, there's more hope for containing it, now that we've got the kind of leadership in the White House that's really committed to making the pandemic a priority for the country. And it's a dramatic change from the previous messaging and policies of President Trump. So I don't think it's going to answer all problems, but it's definitely a change in the right direction. And honestly, as someone in public health, I'm like breathing a sigh of relief that finally we have, science advising and public health advising coming from the White House, and not all the misinformation that we were exposed to in the previous administration.
Thank you, Denise. And I absolutely agree. I was just having that conversation earlier today after I read an article that we're ahead of schedule with vaccine rollout and that we are exceeding expectations. And my reflection was we could be in a very, very different place right now if the election had turned out differently. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful about. Art, you want to answer this question?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And I think very, very hopeful on the turnaround, particularly around the pandemic, and being able to just want to echo everything that Denise, that you just lifted up about just a complete shift from one administration to the other, and the level of seriousness and competency that's happening around the COVID crisis. Now, the other thing that I do think is really important to state that speaks toward both democracy and racial justice is that I think it is also incredibly important that we're pushing the administration to be very, very serious on bold action on racial and economic justice in this moment right now. Our communities are hurting economically from this. If the administration isn't, I think it's incredibly important that we're really pushing for as bold of action as is possible in this moment. And I think for me, as an organizer, the other side of that is that if we're not really getting, if working people aren't being taken care of during this, there's a real danger of all of the things that we were discussing earlier, the kind of violent white nationalism that we're seeing, the kind of rising fascist tendencies. Those actually swell, those grow if this administration is not able to deliver for working people. And so it's not just we need it in this moment, we do. Our communities desperately need that. But it is also important for the future of our democracy that we see very real and serious bold action to make sure that our communities are whole and are taken care of. And I think it'll be really important that we're continuing to push Congress, to push the Senate, to push this administration to make sure that they're actually delivering in this moment.
Are there new challenges that you see? I mean, I think we've acknowledged what the hopeful signs are, but are there particular new challenges that you see with this administration?
Well, I'm worried about the fact that Trump is still perceived as the major leader of the Republican Party. I mean, we had a second impeachment trial, and because of the divided Congress, Trump was not able to be impeached even after the debacle in the Capitol. And so I think, as Art said, there's still going to have to be a lot of pressure and a lot of struggle. The Supreme Court is very conservative. All of the challenges you're talking about with respect to voter suppression, with respect to voting rights, are still there. So I think there's signs of hope, but I don't think we can wait. I mean, I think, people are still believing the election is a fraud, and I think there's still people that are hoping that in 2024, Trump will return to the White House. And so I think that, we still have a lot of work to do.
I think that's the call to action to everybody who's tuned in, is we can't get complacent, and we need to keep pushing forward. Well, we are almost at 6:30, so I just want to wrap up this conversation. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us today and for watching. And also thanks so much to our panelists for this important conversation and for everything that you contributed and all of your insight, and for all of the amazing work that all three of you do. Please feel free to comment wherever you're watching this live stream, and stay tuned for our next panel this spring. And for more information about the program, please do visit riseupforjustice.com. So thank you, everybody, for joining tonight. And